There's two types of people who are against decolonization and against self-determination. Vorschfan Parasocial 69 and 14 Hitler Lover White Power 88. That describes every single one of them. There's no exceptions. Like, I basically made a tweet last week, I think, in order to bait these people, right? Everything about this was set up as a bait. For one, I specifically used the word Indian because most of these people don't know that most Native Americans prefer the word Indian rather than Native American, so they think it's like a slur, right? So that was like intentionally put there as a way to get those people to sort of out themselves as having no idea what they're talking about. And I got like easily 20 people being like, oh my god, he used the word Indian. Haha, what a racist. Two, like, if you actually read it, now I must say this is not a serious plan, okay? It's a bait, but it's still nowhere near as extreme as these people think it would be. Before continuing, I want to make it clear that there is no one who envisions decolonization as like white genocide. That is a talking point of people like Vorsch and other white supremacists, okay? It's not real. At most, what anyone envisions as decolonization, for one, self-determination for anyone who wants it, for indigenous people who want it, etc. And none of that is exclusionary, okay? No one's saying all settlers go back to Europe from 200 years ago. But what they are saying is, okay, this racist, white supremacist US state is obviously, based on slavery and indigenous genocide, is obviously not exactly something that the indigenous people that it genocided and stole land from can really ever be included in, because that's just how it is. It's based on that genocide. So maybe it would be better to sort of reform the state. For example, Bolivia did this. They drafted up an entirely new constitution and renamed the country to the plurinational state of Bolivia. Plurinational meaning the acknowledgement of the fact that Bolivia is a country of many different nations, as in people, descended from Europeans and descended from like 20 different indigenous groups, okay? That's sort of an example of decolonization while still keeping a capitalist liberal sort of system. Well, obviously it's imperfect, but that is what people are talking about. They're not talking about white genocide, okay? Do you know where the idea that indigenous people want to commit white genocide comes from? White settlers who themselves are basically projecting their guilt for what they actually did to indigenous people, and now assuming that indigenous people will be as barbarous as they were. It's complete projection. We did it to them, and now I'm scared that they're going to do it to us. Or buddy, you're lucky, because despite the fact that it would be a whole lot more justified to do what you did to them back to you, they don't want to. So don't worry about it, bud. There's no white genocide. It's nothing but white anxiety, okay? It's simple, baseless white anxiety based on fear of the other, based on the idea that like indigenous people are barbarous savages who could never think about doing anything but genocide. People like Vorsch think like that. That's a fact. And the idea that it's an ethno-state as well is absolutely absurd. Like, even this incredibly extreme plan that I drafted up here is not an ethno-state. Even this literal joke that I made in order to bait complete morons, Nazis and social democrats who were all against self-determination for indigenous people. It says here, people will be moved to the settler containment zone in Florida, of course, but it doesn't say that they will be kept there, okay? It says they will be de-Americanized, okay? And that's a good thing, because the US is a genocidal settler colonial state based on slavery. So its population is upholds these genocidal ideas. They uphold the US nationalism. All of these are awful things, right? It's the same thing as like denazification. If denazification was sincere, it shouldn't be a problem for you. Why would this be a problem for you? Why would that be a problem for you? Why would you be against denazification? That's what this is. The US was founded in a very similar way to the way that the Nazis wanted to found their Eastern settler colonial empire. So what's the difference? There's none. And then it says, right, if you overcome this genocidal settler colonial slavery ideology that you have implanted into your brain from birth, through schooling, through propaganda, everything, you will be eligible for citizenship in the new Indian territory, whatever that looks like. Now, for one, Indian territory is obviously very reductive because there's tons of different indigenous nations in the US, but they will be given citizenship, equal citizenship. So you can't say that it's an ethno-state by any way, but these people still will call it an ethno-state because for them, what ethno-state means, a state that is not founded on white settler colonial slaver dominance. That's what they think. It's basically like a fear that they will not have the privileges that they have now. The reason why they conceive of indigenous self-determination as ethnostatism is because they themselves are ethnostatus, okay? The US was explicitly founded as a white ethnostate. Native sovereignty over the US would be no different to like, Irish sovereignty over Northern Ireland. It's no less justified. Doesn't matter how realistic you think it is. Like, if you hear and it makes you really uncomfortable and you start yelling about ethnostates and genocide, it's clear where you're coming from. Totally clear. You know, the thing that makes settler colonialism bad and wrong is not that the people who did it are white. It's that they did settler colonialism. Non-white people can do settler colonialism. The Japanese did it. But look, the point of what I want to say here is basically that, one, what makes decolonization necessary is not that there's white people in a place. It's that those white people happen to be the ones who colonized that place, okay? Who engaged in genocide, land theft, and settler colonialism. They killed or removed the indigenous inhabitants of that land to replace them with their own settlers to steal the land. Okay, that's the problem. Nothing to do with their whiteness, everything to do with their material relation to the land and what they did to the people who lived there before them. As I said earlier, like the idea of there being, like, you know, native people want to do a genocide, and if you give them self-determination, it's going to result in white genocide is absolutely absurd. It's nothing more than projection coming from people descended from settlers, projecting what their ancestors did to Native American people onto them and just assuming that they are as barbaric as they were. Usually because they conceive of Native American people as barbaric themselves. And, you know, the idea that like indigenous sovereignty could not be more positive, would not be better overall than the literal white supremacist genocidal slave state, the USA. That is the basis of the USA. The USA has one of the most untouched constitutions in the world, by the way. That is basically 200 years overdue to be replaced. Like the idea that native people should not have sovereignty, even over the tiny little parcels of land that they still hold, is totally absurd. It's even more absurd to think that like the US would be more positive. Like maintaining this US settler colonial genocidal state would be more positive than at the very least radically reforming it into something completely new that recognizes indigenous nations and their autonomy. And when I say indigenous nations, that doesn't mean a fucking ethno-state, right? Like, it's as absurd as saying, for example, that Catalonia is an ethno-state. These ideas that, like, indigenous self-determination equals you being deported comes from your practices that you do, practices that you're afraid of other people doing to you that you actively do to others in the current state formation that exists in your country. The idea of blood quantum was introduced by whites when they were trying to exclude people with Indian blood from white society. They invented the idea of blood quantum. Like, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that someone who isn't ethnically Indian could not become like a citizen of some hypothetical indigenous or multiple indigenous states. In the same way that like someone who isn't ethnically French in the terms of like indigeneity could not become a citizen of France or like culturally French, considered an equal to everyone else, or at least ideally considered an equal to everyone else. If anything, indigenous people as a whole are far more open to these sorts of things. Ask like any fucking Aboriginal person in Australia, and the vast majority of them will tell you that like they think that anyone who wants to come and live in Australia should be able to, sincerely, and that the fact that the white supremacist Australian government doesn't allow that is bullshit. Everything to do with this opposition to decolonization and indigenous self-determination is either racism, complete projection, or like the desire to maintain white supremacy. Like, you cannot be against self-determination and be anything resembling not a reactionary. Self-determination is a liberal principle. It's enshrined in UN international law. You cannot be against self-determination. By the way, it's illegal under all kinds of international law to implant settler populations into conquered territory. And if we apply that retroactively, the US is an illegal state. It has no legal basis to exist. So like, even by liberal principles, you cannot implant settlers into a territory. Ergo, those settlers are not entitled to self-determination, which is also legally enshrined in liberal international law. So these aren't even leftist principles. These are like centrist principles, even right-of-center principles. The only people who oppose these things, at least on a theoretical basis, should be reactionary conservatives who believe in might makes right. Yeah, we have a bunch of like purported social democrats and socialists who are firmly against them. And the reason for that is everything that I've gone over talking about this here. It's really funny that these people love to say that indigenous self-determination amounts to white genocide and, ethnostatism, etc. Because the fact of the matter is that the USA is a country that is based on those things, so much so that the people who they compare you to, the Nazis, Hitler, etc., look to the USA as their inspiration. for what they were going to do in Eastern Europe. So if you want to talk about someone being a Nazi, it's not the fucking indigenous people who want self-determination, those who support their self-determination, and those who support a reformation of these settler colonial nation states, or at least self-determination for the nations within them. It's the fucking people on the other side who are calling you a Nazi and Hitler, etc. They're the ones who are like the Nazis. I have met so few Americans who purport to be on the left who are not just straight up nationalists in this sense. Like someone like Bush, for example, who just openly displays a fucking American flag. Dude, that's a symbol that is like a Nazi symbol, effectively. You did genocide. You did genocide. You stole the land, and then you made a flag to represent your new state founded on this land that you stole via genocide. And you're proud of that symbol? You're proud of that? That's a good thing for you? It's no different to someone displaying a Nazi flag 200 years later, like in a hypothetical world where the Nazis won. It's no less absurd.